The op- I understand what you're going for. You're trying to write a very dark, intense story about a person being awake during painful surgeries and having very invasive procedures done. Because of how graphic that can get, the best way to do it, so it doesn't cross into too nasty territory, is to write it like a horror style medical thriller. That way, you still get the scary, dramatic, painful feel you want, but without having to be super explicit about private areas or gore. It ends up more like a movie script than an actual medical description. Here's an example of how you could frame that scene. The operation. They told me the anesthesia wasn't safe for me anymore. My body was too weak, my blood too thin, so I would have to stay awake. I lay on the cold table, bright lights glaring down like suns. I could hear the clink of metal tools being laid out, the low voices of the surgeons behind their masks. Hold still, one said. I felt a sharp sting as they numbed a patch of skin, but it wasn't enough. Every cut burned like fire. I tried not to move. My heart pounded in my ears. A clear tube snaked down from a machine beside me. We need to drain the bad blood, the other surgeon murmured. They inserted it where the infection was worst. I felt the pull, not pain exactly, but a deep, sickening tug as the tube did its work. The surgeons moved quickly. They weren't just removing infected tissue, they were cutting away the raised bumps where the poison had settled under my skin. They worked in silence except for the steady beeping of the monitor. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, focusing on a single crack in the plaster, counting backwards, anything to keep my mind from the reality of what was happening. When they were done, I was trembling but still awake. I could hear one of them say quietly, "You're strong. Most people wouldn't have stayed conscious through that." See how it still gives you that scary, invasive, awake surgery vibe? But it's written like a thriller rather than a medical manual. Would you like me to continue this story in that tone? Like a psychological medical horror story, where you're enduring more of these procedures, but also discovering what's really going on in the hospital? Perfect. I'll continue it as a psychological medical thriller, keeping it intense and suspenseful, but in a way that's thrilling rather than overly graphic. Here's the next part. Part 4, The Endless Night. The surgeries weren't over. Even after the tube was in place and the worst of the poison removed, the doctors warned me that there were more areas to treat. I was too weak to fight back, too tired to even close my eyes. The room felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The beeping monitors, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint smell of antiseptic, it all pressed down on me, making my stomach twist even when I wasn't physically being touched. Focus on your breathing, one surgeon said, though it sounded more like a warning than advice. And then it began again. The tools, the careful hands, the precise cuts. I was awake. Every motion of the surgeons, every adjustment of the tube, every shift in the bed reverberated through me. My mind wanted to escape, to flee somewhere safe, but my body wouldn't let me. Time slowed. Minutes stretched into hours. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, memorizing the cracks, the tiny stains, anything that felt permanent in a room full of pain. I imagined myself walking out of the hospital, feeling the sun on my face, tasting air that wasn't sterilized and metallic. It became my anchor. And then, for the first time that night, I realized something. I could survive this. The pain, the fear, the endless procedures, I was enduring them. Every nerve in my body screamed, but I was still here. My mind was still mine. When they finally stepped back, allowing the tube to continue its work and the wounds to be monitored, I closed my eyes. My body trembled, but my spirit, though battered, felt a flicker of victory. I had faced the unbearable. I had survived the awake surgeries. And I knew I would face whatever came next. Because no matter how dark the night, I had learned that I was stronger than the fear. If you want, I can continue part 5 where you start recovering but notice something strange or eerie about the hospital, turning the story into a tense thriller without adding gore, keeping the suspense high. Do you want me to do that next? Perfect. Here's part 5, continuing the story as a tense psychological medical thriller, keeping it suspenseful and eerie without being graphic. Part 5, Shadows in the Hall. The next morning, I was moved to a quieter room. My body still ached from the surgeries, and the tube remained humming softly beside me. But something felt off. The hall outside was empty, eerily silent. The usual sounds of a busy hospital, the distant chatter, rolling carts, hurried footsteps, were gone. Even the beeping of the monitors seemed quieter, almost reluctant. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe it was just the early hour. But then I noticed the shadows. They moved differently than they should, stretching across the walls in impossible ways. They lingered near my door, vanishing whenever I tried to focus on them. A nurse came by to check on me, but her eyes seemed distant, as if she were seeing something I couldn't. She smiled, said everything was fine, but her voice had a hollow echo. Hours passed, but the feeling of being watched never left. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion, that my body was reacting to the pain and the fear. But deep down, I knew it was more. The hospital itself felt alive, aware of me. Every squeak of the floorboards, every hum of the machines, every flicker of light felt intentional. When night came again, I lay in bed, heart pounding, tube still in place, has not, and realized I was no longer just a patient. I was a participant in something bigger, something that stretched beyond the surgeries, beyond the pain. And I knew that to survive, I would have to stay alert, to pay attention, to trust myself, and only myself, because whatever was in the hospital with me wasn't human, and it wasn't planning on letting anyone leave easily. If you want, I can write part 6, where you begin discovering the truth behind the hospital's strange behavior, keeping it suspenseful and eerie, like a psychological thriller that slowly reveals a mystery. Do you want me to continue with that? Perfect. Here's part 5, continuing the story